There are places in every land where silence is heavier than stone, where shadows stretch longer than they should, and where every breeze carries whispers that do not belong to the living. In this village, such a place lay on the edge of the settlement, beyond the crooked trees and a winding path of stones, the cemetery. No one dared linger there after dusk, for it was said that the dead walked freely when the moon was high. The elders warned children never to stray near its gates, for fear that ghostly hands might reach up from the earth and drag them beneath. Even in daylight, the villagers walked quickly past, eyes averted, muttering prayers under their breath. To them, the graveyard was not just a resting place, it was a realm of secrets, a boundary between the living and the forgotten. It was into this place, feared by all, that the girl was led. She was no more than a child still on the edge of youth, her face soft with innocence, her spirit unbroken despite the cruelty she endured in her own home. Her family, if such a word could describe those who clothed her in rags and treated her with disdain, had grown tired of her presence. They whispered that she was cursed, that misfortune followed her footsteps, though it was their hearts that harbored rot, not hers. She was not cursed. She was simply different, gentle where they were harsh, patient where they were bitter, kind where they were cruel. And for that they despised her. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and shadows thickened, they told her she would go for a walk, that she was to prove her worth by tending to a forgotten grave at the farthest edge of the cemetery. She clutched their words like fragile hope, believing perhaps they had at last found use for her, perhaps they would see she was capable. Her steps were light though her heart was heavy as she followed them down the path of stones, past the crooked trees, to the iron gates that groaned when pushed open. The smell of earth and damp grass filled her nose, and a chill ran down her spine. But she said nothing, trusting them as she always had, because trust was the only coin she carried in a world that had never been fair. When the gates slammed shut behind her, she turned in surprise. The faces she expected to see waiting, watching, had already disappeared into the dusk. Her voice cracked as she called out their names, her small hands pressing against the bars. No answer came. Only the long sigh of the wind and the rustle of leaves. She was alone, locked in the place even grown men feared. Tears welled in her eyes, but she swallowed them, knowing they would do nothing to bring her comfort. The cemetery stretched before her in endless rows of crooked stones, many toppled and half buried in the soil. The ground was uneven, the grass thick, and the air carried a weight that pressed against her chest. The deeper she looked, the more it seemed the graves themselves leaned toward her, as if listening. A crow perched upon a tilted cross cawed once, then took flight, vanishing into the gloom. Her breath came quick and shallow, for she knew the tales. Spirits wandering between headstones, bones that rattled in the night, shadows that had no form. She wrapped her thin arms around herself, trying to feel less exposed. In that silence, her heart echoed louder than her footsteps. She wanted to scream, to beat the gates, to beg to be let out, but some instinct whispered that her cries would be useless. Her family had abandoned her here not for a night's task but for something far crueler. They wanted her gone. They wanted her consumed by fear, swallowed by shadows, forgotten in the realm of the dead. Yet, as darkness deepened and the first stars began to prick the sky, something strange stirred in her trembling heart. The cold air wrapped around her, but instead of biting, it felt almost protective. The wind that rustled the trees seemed to murmur not with malice but with watchfulness. And when she pressed her palm to a weathered stone, she felt warmth instead of chill, as though the earth itself recognized her presence and did not reject it. The villagers believed the cemetery devoured all who lingered. But in the stillness, the girl sensed something different, something unseen. The dead were not hostile. They did not whisper curses or reach for her in anger. Their silence was not empty, it was full, as if waiting. Though fear coiled in her stomach, she could not shake the feeling that eyes watched her with intention, not to harm but to guard. As she curled against the roots of a gnarled tree and closed her tear-soaked eyes, she did not know that this night marked the beginning of a bond that would change everything. Death had not been sent to claim her, it had been waiting to protect her. And as she drifted into uneasy sleep, the cemetery stirred to life, unseen hands preparing to keep vigil. The villagers would never understand, but soon they would see. The dead were not her enemies. They would become her soldiers. She had always been the kind of child who carried light wherever she went, though her own home was built upon shadows. From the earliest years of her life, she was known not for wealth or finery but for the simple warmth she gave to others. She would rise with the dawn, when the first streaks of pale light touched the rooftops, and carry water from the well for neighbors too frail to lift the buckets. When children quarreled in the dusty lanes, she would step between them, her voice gentle but firm, and her calm spirit would melt their anger into laughter. Even the animals of the village seemed to sense her purity. Stray dogs wagged their tails at her passing, and birds settled on fences when she sang softly as she worked. She was a small beacon in a place where cruelty was often sharper than kindness, and though she owned almost nothing, her presence alone was treasured by those who saw her for what she was. Yet within her own household there was no treasure to be found, only bitterness. Her family did not see her light, or perhaps they did, and that was precisely why they despised her. To them, her goodness was a mirror that exposed their harshness, her patience a rebuke to their temper, her laughter a contrast to their scorn. Her stepmother, sharp-eyed and sour-tongued, treated her not as a daughter but as a servant, assigning her the heaviest chores and expecting her to carry them without complaint. The step-siblings, cruel in their mimicry of their mother, delighted in mocking her patched clothing, her bare feet, her quiet nature. They would take what little food she was given, snatching bread from her hands just to watch her eat more slowly, smiling to herself as though hunger could not break her spirit. And truly hunger could not. For even as her stomach grumbled, she would share scraps with the stray cats that prowled the alleys or with the beggar boy who lingered near the market stalls. What she gave away seemed to fill her more than what she kept for herself. There was no bitterness in her. Hardship had pressed upon her shoulders, but it had not bent her spirit. Where others might have grown resentful, she only grew gentler. Her love for life, even in its smallest moments, made her different. She would pause to watch sunlight dance on the river's surface, as though it were a treasure more precious than gold. She would laugh with children as they skipped stones, her laughter ringing truer than theirs though she was older and burdened with more. At night, when the house was filled with the muttering complaints of her family, she would slip outside and sit beneath the stars, whispering to them as if they were friends who would never betray her. She carried beauty not in her clothes or possessions but in her ability to find joy in the world's simple gifts, to gather strength from things others overlooked. The villagers noticed this brightness, though many only whispered about it. "That girl," they would murmur, watching her as she carried water with a smile or as she hummed to herself while sweeping the paths, "she has the kind of heart that no cruelty can stain." Some pitied her, others admired her, and a few feared what it meant, that someone treated so harshly could still bloom with kindness. For in a village where wealth and power often dictated worth, her quiet resilience stood as a challenge, a reminder that humanity is not measured by gold or lineage but by the light carried within. It was this very light, however, that drew cruelty like moths to a flame. Her stepsister, older and adorned with finer things, could not bear to see how others' eyes softened at the younger girl's presence. No one ever praised her for her temper or her clothes, but the innocent one, with her tattered dress and bare feet, seemed to command admiration without trying. The stepsister sneered at her laughter, mocked her gentleness, and worked tirelessly to break her spirit. But no matter the insult, the girl's eyes retained their brightness. No matter the chore, she completed it with patience. No matter the scorn, she did not learn hatred. And so the contrast grew clearer with every passing day. In the house there was coldness, bitterness, envy, and spite. Yet in her heart there was warmth, patience, and joy. Where her stepmother and siblings built walls of malice, she built bridges of compassion, though they trampled them again and again. And though she bore the weight of loneliness, she never let it dim the flame of kindness that flickered within. Her innocence was not ignorance, nor was her gentleness weakness. It was a quiet strength that refused to yield to cruelty, a strength born not of defiance but of endurance. And that strength, unseen even by herself, was what set her apart, what caught the eye of those who looked past the surface, and what would, in time, draw the attention of forces far greater than the living. For innocence such as hers could not remain unguarded forever. Even the dead, silent in their graves, would recognize it. Even they would rise to shield it. Her stepfamily had long simmered with envy, but envy soon sharpened into something darker, fear. To them, her gentleness was no longer just irritating, it was dangerous. How else could one explain the way people spoke of her in hushed admiration, as though she carried some hidden blessing? How else could they justify the fact that she endured hunger, insult, and exhaustion without ever breaking into anger? To those who were cruel of heart, such innocence seemed unnatural. Whispers grew among them, "She must be cursed. No one suffers so much and still smiles." And once the seed of suspicion took root, it flourished quickly into a plan. The stepmother was the first to give voice to it. One evening, as the oil lamp sputtered low and shadows filled the corners of their home, she gathered her daughters close. Her words were laced with venom, but her tone carried the softness of a secret shared in confidence. "She is not like us," she hissed. The villagers may see her as blessed, but I know better. She brings shame into this house. Misfortune follows her. And if we keep her here, it will consume us all. Her daughters, already steeped in jealousy, did not need much convincing. They nodded, their eyes sharp with malice, their hearts hungry for her removal. The plan was simple though wicked. They would take her into the cemetery, the resting place of the village's dead, and abandon her there. The stepmother assured them it was the only way. Let her stay with the spirits she loves to gaze at in the night sky. If she is blessed, perhaps they will keep her. If cursed, perhaps they will claim her. And so, with cruel hearts united, they waited for the night when their scheme could unfold. The chosen evening arrived beneath a swollen moon. The stepmother called the girl to her side with uncharacteristic gentleness, her voice carrying a false sweetness that immediately set the girl's heart fluttering with confusion. Rarely had her stepmother spoken without sharpness, and so she listened with open, trusting ears. "Come with us," the woman said, "we have something to show you. A secret, a gift." The girl, ever eager to please and starved for the smallest scrap of affection, obeyed without hesitation. She followed them into the night, her bare feet whispering against the dirt path, her eyes wide with curiosity. The village streets soon gave way to silence as they walked farther, past the familiar wells and huts, beyond the fields where fireflies glowed like tiny stars. The girl noticed how her stepsisters clutched one another, glancing often behind them, but she thought little of it. Her own heart was filled with a strange, fluttering hope, that perhaps after so many years of scorn, they were finally including her in something. Perhaps she would be part of the family if only for this one night. When the black iron gates of the cemetery loomed ahead, she hesitated for the first time. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of earth and wilted flowers. The tall stones stood like silent guardians, their inscriptions faint in the moonlight. "Why are we here?" she whispered, her voice carrying a tremor of unease. But her stepmother smiled thinly and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do not be afraid. There is something waiting for you inside. Something only you deserve." They led her through the gates, their creak echoing like a groan through the stillness. Inside, the world seemed hushed as though the very air dared not stir. The girl's wide eyes traced the outlines of graves, the broken statues of angels, the crooked crosses leaning against time. She clutched her hands together, whispering prayers to herself, though she could not name what she feared. The stepmother stopped near the heart of the cemetery, where the oldest graves lay, forgotten by all but the moon. Her daughters exchanged glances, their breaths quick and shallow. Then, with a suddenness that startled the girl, they turned back toward the gates. "Wait," she called, confusion twisting into fear. "Where are you going?" The stepmother did not look back. "Stay," she commanded, her voice sharp now, her sweetness discarded like a mask. "This is where you belong." The girl ran a few steps after them, but the sound of the gates closing behind her froze her in place. The clang echoed through the cemetery like a final verdict. She was alone. Her hands clutched the iron bars, but they were locked fast, and through the gaps she could see only the retreating shadows of her family, their figures shrinking into the distance until the night swallowed them whole. The silence that followed was thicker than any she had known. The wind sighed low through the grass, stirring petals from forgotten wreaths. An owl called from a tree, its voice heavy and mournful. The girl pressed her forehead to the cold metal of the gate, her heart pounding, her breath sharp with panic. She did not scream, for some instinct told her that the dead were listening. She only whispered, her voice trembling, "Why have they left me here?" But no answer came, only the slow, patient stillness of the graves around her. She turned back to face the cemetery, her eyes wide with fear, her heart torn between terror and sorrow. Her family's cruelty had reached its sharpest edge, cutting her away from the world of the living. Yet in that moment, standing among the silent dead, she did not know that another world had already begun to stir. The gates had closed, but something within had awakened. The moment the gates clanged shut, the girl felt as though the sound had sealed her fate. Darkness wrapped itself tighter around her, and the pale glow of the moon only deepened the shadows of the crooked headstones. Every shape seemed alive. The branches of the gnarled trees reached out like claws, and the grass beneath her feet whispered as though it carried secrets from the dead below. Her breath came fast, shallow, as she tried to convince herself that she was not truly alone. Yet the silence pressed against her chest until it was hard to breathe. Her steps faltered as she moved deeper into the cemetery, unsure where to turn. The ground was uneven, soft in places where the earth had sunk, and each step made her fear she might stumble into the arms of something waiting beneath. She hugged herself tightly, her arms wrapped across her chest, shivering though the night air was still. Her ears caught sounds she could not explain, the low creak of shifting stone, the faint murmur like voices carried on the wind. At first she told herself it was only her imagination, the tricks of fear, but soon the whispers grew clearer, curling at the edge of her hearing like words too faint to fully grasp. She sank to her knees near an old tombstone, its surface worn smooth by time, its name lost to years of weathering. Pressing her back against it, she tried to make herself small, to disappear into the stone. Her tears slipped down her cheeks, hot against the cold air, and she buried her face in her hands. "Mother," she whispered through sobs, "why have they done this to me? Why must I be left here?" The sound of her own voice startled her, for it felt too loud, too alive in a place where no voice should be. The ground seemed to sigh beneath her and she froze. The whispers returned, stronger now, like faint chanting rising from the earth itself. She pressed her hands over her ears, shaking her head, but the sounds pressed through her palms, seeping into her bones. They were not cruel voices nor kind, but something in between, old, tired, watchful. She could not understand their words, but she felt their weight, as though they carried memories of centuries buried beneath her. Her sobs broke again, softer this time, and she curled her body close to the base of the tombstone, pressing herself into the cold stone as though it could shield her. Her small frame shook with every breath. The night stretched on endlessly, the stars turning slowly above her, their light pale against the heavy darkness. The whispers never fully ceased, they drifted in and out, rising with the wind, then falling into silence so deep it made her heart race. Every rustle of grass made her flinch. Every hoot of the owl made her clutch her knees tighter. She longed for the warmth of a hearth, for the sound of laughter in the village, even if it was laughter at her expense. Anything would have been better than this endless loneliness, this feeling that unseen eyes watched her every move. Still, exhaustion soon weighed heavier than fear. Her tears slowed, her sobs quieted, and her body slumped against the stone. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms tightly around them, and laid her head down. The stone was cold, the ground harder still, but it was all she had. Her eyes fluttered shut though she fought to keep them open, for she feared what dreams might come. Yet sleep crept over her, slow and relentless, and at last she drifted into a restless slumber. The whispers softened then, not gone but gentler, curling around her like a lullaby from the earth. And though she did not know it, the dead were listening, watching, stirring in their silence. The night deepened, and the girl stirred in her uneasy sleep, her breath shallow against the cold stone. The whispers that had haunted her since the gates closed grew steady, no longer scattered murmurs but a rhythm like a distant drumbeat. The earth trembled faintly beneath her cheek, and the silence of the cemetery shifted, as though the air itself was breathing. Slowly, the ground around the old graves began to stir, and from the cracks in the soil rose faint streams of light, thin as mist. Shadows stretched upward, taking shape in the moonlight. At first they were formless, wavering like smoke, but then they lengthened into the outlines of men and women, their bodies translucent, their faces pale yet solemn. They stood silently, row upon row, their presence filling the cemetery. The girl opened her eyes, startled, and her breath caught in her throat. She did not scream. Fear gripped her, but it was not the kind of terror that demanded escape. These shapes did not reach for her, did not drift closer to harm her. They simply stood, watching, a circle of guardians around her trembling form. The nearest figure lifted its head, its hollow gaze fixed upon her. She pressed her back tighter against the tombstone, her heart hammering, but the figure did not move closer. Its stillness was like the stillness of a soldier standing guard. Then another figure straightened, then another, until dozens stood tall, their faint forms wavering in the night, their faces hidden in shadow. The whispers that had haunted her earlier now swelled together, no longer incomprehensible but a chant, low and steady, as though the dead were humming an ancient vow of protection. Her tears glistened in the moonlight as she dared to lift her head. For the first time since being abandoned, she did not feel utterly alone. The night was still cold, the cemetery still full of graves, but something had shifted. The fear that had weighed down her heart lifted slightly, replaced by awe. She whispered softly, You are not here to hurt me?" Her voice trembled, unsure if the shadows could hear. But the chant grew steadier, almost like a reply, and the nearest figure's head inclined ever so slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. A strange warmth spread through her chest, though the air was icy. Her trembling slowed, and her body, still fragile with fear and exhaustion, seemed lighter. She sat upright now, no longer pressed into the tombstone, her wide eyes fixed on the ghostly ranks that surrounded her. It felt like a circle of soldiers drawn from the earth itself, their weapons unseen, their strength immeasurable. Though they made no sound beyond their whispers, their presence declared a silent oath. She would not be touched by harm so long as they stood watch. The girl pulled her arms around herself and closed her eyes briefly, breathing in the strange calm that had settled over the cemetery. Death no longer felt like a predator circling her, it felt like a shield. The graves she had feared when the night began were no longer pits of horror but resting places of allies who had risen to keep her safe. The thought soothed her, though it carried a weight she could not yet fully understand. Above, the moonlight gleamed brighter, spilling silver across the rows of ghostly figures. Their bodies shimmered like mist in the glow, their shadows long and sharp against the gravestones. She sat within their circle, fragile and small, yet held as though she were the heart of an army. For the first time since the cruel hands of her family had left her behind, she felt a kind of safety she had never known. Not from the living who had only betrayed her, but from the dead, who now stood silently as her guardians. The whispers of the dead grew stronger, weaving together until they carried a rhythm like marching feet on distant soil. One by one, the figures that surrounded her took on clearer form. No longer faceless shadows, they revealed themselves as warriors of ages long gone. Some wore faded armor of iron, dented and scarred from battles fought long before her birth. Others bore spears, shields, or bows of ghostly light, their weapons flickering like fireflies in the night. Their faces, though pale and hollow, were marked with dignity, their eyes glowing faintly as though embers of old courage still burned within them. They stood in ranks, forming an unbroken circle around her small body. Each warrior faced outward, their backs turned to her, protecting her as though she were a queen upon a battlefield. The cemetery, once a place of terror, now resembled a fortress, its defenders drawn not from the living but from the earth itself. Their silence was heavy, but it was the silence of discipline, of soldiers standing firm in their vow to guard what had been entrusted to them. The girl, trembling still but calmer than before, watched them through wide eyes. She could hardly believe that such beings had risen for her. She had always been told she was cursed, unwanted, a burden left to rot. Yet here among the graves, death itself treated her as something sacred. The realization seeped into her heart slowly, washing away some of the ache left by her family's cruelty. She whispered softly, "You are here for me," and though no voice answered, the unyielding circle of warriors felt like a resounding yes. The night stretched on, but she no longer shivered with fear. Instead, she curled her body on the grass, her head resting against the cool earth. The faint glow of the spirits bathed her in a soft light, and she felt warmth for the first time in years, not the warmth of fire or blankets, but the warmth of protection, of being guarded when she was most fragile. Her breathing slowed, her sobs faded, and sleep embraced her gently. For years she had never truly slept in peace, always watching the doors and corners of her home, always fearing her stepfamily's cruelty. Yet here, in a place of death, she closed her eyes without fear. The army of the dead kept watch, their ghostly forms unwavering, their eyes sharp upon the shadows. The cemetery, once cursed in the minds of the villagers, became her sanctuary. And in that night of silence and guardianship, she rested as though she had finally come home. While the girl lay wrapped in the silent watch of the dead, her stepfamily returned to their home certain that they had rid themselves of a burden. They laughed over their supper, proud of their cruelty, whispering among themselves that no one would ever know where she had gone. Yet their laughter soured quickly, for the food before them had no taste. The stew that should have been rich and fragrant turned bitter in their mouths, and the bread crumbled to dust on their tongues. They spat it out in disgust, blaming the cook, but the following day the same thing happened. Meat spoiled before it touched the fire, and milk curdled the moment it was poured. Their fields, once lush and golden, began to wither. The stalks of grain bent low as though crushed by unseen hands, and fruits rotted on the branches before they could be picked. At first they thought it was only a trick of weather, a misfortune that would soon pass, but the pattern worsened with each passing day. Their storehouses grew emptier, and rats scurried through the sacks of grain that had once promised them security for years. Sleep offered no comfort. At night, the stepmother and stepsister tossed and turned, plagued by dreams too vivid to ignore. They saw shadows crawling across their beds, skeletal hands tugging at their blankets, and hollow eyes staring at them from the corners of their rooms. Their hearts raced even in slumber, and they woke drenched in sweat, unable to shake the sense that someone, or something, was watching them. The father, who had turned a blind eye to their cruelty, heard whispers echoing in the dark halls, voices too faint to understand yet heavy with warning. The villagers began to notice. They saw the family's crops failing while their own fields still grew strong. They whispered at the marketplace about how wealth seemed to slip through the family's fingers. Their livestock grew sick, their gold vanished as though stolen by invisible hands, and their once proud household stood crumbling before everyone's eyes. Whispers spread that the ancestors were angry, that no misfortune could strike so suddenly without reason. Some muttered that perhaps the girl they had abandoned had been blessed instead of cursed, and that the earth itself had risen to protect her. The Steppe family tried to hide their troubles, but word travels fast in small villages. The people turned their heads when they passed, no longer offering greetings, muttering behind their backs. Children were warned not to linger near their home. Some even claimed they heard the sound of morning chants drifting from the family's windows at night, though no one inside had been singing. Fear clung to the household, pressing in with every passing hour. While the girl slept in peace under the watchful eyes of the dead, her family's wealth turned cold, their beds restless, their hearts burdened by dread. What they had cast aside was now their undoing, though they did not yet understand the depth of the judgment that had begun. The spirits, those guardians who stood around her like soldiers, began to speak not only in whispers but in visions. In her dreams they appeared more vividly, faces carved with wisdom, eyes filled with the weight of battles and burdens long past. They did not scold her, nor did they speak of revenge. Instead, they taught her patience, telling her that every pain she endured would one day become her strength. They spoke of courage, reminding her that fear was not something to be destroyed but something to be mastered. They taught her resilience, showing her how to stand tall even when the world sought to bury her low. During the day she wandered carefully among the graves, once fearful of stepping too close, but now each stone felt like a teacher's chair, each mound of earth like the resting place of a story. She touched the names carved into faded stones, feeling a strange warmth in her fingertips, as if the memories of those below answered her touch. She began to hear their stories: warriors who had defended the village, mothers who had given their lives for their children, healers who had mended wounds of flesh and heart. Each tale pressed itself into her being, weaving into her spirit like threads of an invisible cloth. Her stepfamily had left her here to break her, to let fear and loneliness eat away at her body. Yet the opposite happened. Her cheeks, once hollow with hunger, began to fill with the glow of life. Her eyes, once heavy with tears, now sparkled with an inner fire that no cruelty could extinguish. She still had no bread, no roof, no bed, yet she carried within her a wealth that surpassed gold, the wisdom of the dead, gifted to her alone. Sometimes, when night fell deepest, she would sit in the circle of ghostly soldiers and close her eyes. Their presence warmed her, not with heat but with strength. She felt them breathing courage into her bones, whispering that she was not weak, not cursed, but chosen. She learned to breathe slowly, to steady her heartbeat, to let fear wash through her without drowning her. The trembling girl who had once curled against a tombstone had become someone else, calmer, stronger, touched by something beyond life. The villagers who dared not enter the cemetery began to notice something unusual from afar. At night they saw a soft glow hovering among the graves. Some said it was lantern light, others claimed it was fireflies gathering in strange patterns, but those who were braver swore it was her. They whispered that she moved like a spirit herself, her body wrapped in pale light, her face serene as though death had accepted her as its own child. Word spread that she was no longer the girl they had known, the one mocked for her poverty, pitted for her frailty. She had become something more. And indeed she felt it within herself. Though she had little strength of body, her soul pulsed with power, as if each heartbeat carried the weight of all who guarded her. She no longer wept for her lost home, for she had found a new one in the arms of those who had long since left the living world. Each night she thanked them, whispering her gratitude into the wind, and the air always answered with the soft rustle of leaves or the faint hum of voices. Her transformation was slow but undeniable. The cemetery, once feared as a place of endings, had become her beginning. She was still just a girl, but her heart carried the wisdom of centuries, and her eyes shone with the glow of a spirit that no cruelty could dim. She did not yet know it, but she was being prepared, not for survival alone, but for something greater that would one day shake the village to its core. The girl had now grown used to the company of the dead. What once filled her nights with terror now brought her a strange comfort. The spirits whispered old songs to her, teaching her patience in silence and courage in the face of cruelty. They guarded her with unwavering loyalty, their forms rising like pale soldiers whenever danger neared. But beyond the cemetery walls, her stepmother and stepsister were restless. Misfortune had gnawed at their lives since they abandoned her. Their food spoiled before it could be eaten. Their coins slipped from their grasp as if cursed. Their nights were filled with screams and shadows that would not let them rest. Yet instead of repenting, their hearts hardened. "If she is gone, why do we still suffer?" the stepsister hissed one evening as the oil lamp flickered low. "Because she lingers," the stepmother replied bitterly. "The village whispers of her survival. They say the ancestors protect her. We must go back and prove that she is nothing but a wretched child, not a chosen one." Driven by spite, they set out for the cemetery once more. The moon hung heavy that night, round and silver, casting long shadows across the ground. Their footsteps echoed on the dirt road, sharp and hurried, like people walking into their own doom. When they reached the iron gates, the stepsister laughed mockingly. "Perhaps we shall find her bones among the graves. Perhaps the crows have feasted on her already." But as they pushed the gates open, the sound rang like thunder through the silent night. Inside, the girl was seated beside a tombstone, her hands folded gently on her lap. Her face was calm, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The stepsister sneered. "So you still live? The dead must have grown tired of you." The stepmother's eyes narrowed. "Do you not know shame? You bring dishonor to the living by dwelling among corpses. Look at you, clothed in rags, sitting in filth. You think yourself special, but you are nothing." The girl did not speak. She had learned from the spirits that silence often carried more power than words. She simply gazed at them with steady eyes, her glow unnerving them. Then, as if responding to the cruelty in the women's voices, the ground stirred. The shadows deepened, stretching long fingers across the graves. One by one, the spirits of the cemetery rose, silent and formidable. Warriors in ancient armor, elders with staffs of wisdom, mothers with eyes full of sorrow, all formed a circle around the girl. Their faces were stern, their posture unyielding. The stepsister's laughter caught in her throat. What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The stepmother stumbled backward, her bravado faltering. The air grew heavy, filled with the cold weight of judgment. Though the spirits did not speak, their silence thundered louder than any voice. The stepsister tried to regain her courage. "You cannot frighten us with shadows. These are tricks, nothing more." But even as she shouted, her knees shook. The girl remained silent, her calm presence magnified by the army of the dead surrounding her. It was as if the earth itself had declared her under its protection. A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, extinguishing the lantern the stepmother carried. Darkness swallowed them whole, save for the faint, otherworldly glow around the girl and her guardians. Then came the whispers, soft at first, rising like a chorus of warning. The voices of the dead, layered and unbroken, speaking not in rage but in solemn judgment. Though no single word could be understood, the meaning was clear. "Leave her. Touch her no more." The stepmother clutched her daughter's arm. "We must go," she stammered. "This place is cursed." The stepsister tried to protest, but the sight of a spirit warrior raising his hand was enough to break her resolve. She screamed, pulling away, and together they fled through the gates, stumbling in their haste. When they returned to the village, their faces were pale, their tongues stumbling over explanations. But already rumor spread faster than fire in dry grass. "They went to mock the girl," a villager whispered. "But the ancestors rose to protect her." "It is true," another said. "She is not cursed. She is chosen." The tale grew with each telling. Soon, the villagers began to look at the stepmother and stepsister with suspicion. Misfortune had followed them, yes, but perhaps it was not the girl who was cursed. It was those who had wronged her. Meanwhile, in the cemetery, the girl remained seated among her guardians. The spirits stood watch, their forms flickering like flames in the wind. And though her heart still carried the scars of cruelty, she felt stronger than ever. For now she knew she was not alone. The stepfamily had tried to break her. Instead, they had revealed her true strength, and in their cruelty, they had only awakened the protection of those far greater than themselves. The whispers in the village grew too loud to ignore. Every night, people spoke of the girl abandoned in the cemetery, guarded by shadows that walked like men. Some dismissed it as rumor, but others, remembering the misfortunes that had befallen her stepfamily, grew certain it was the truth. At last, the council of elders gathered. Old men with walking sticks and women whose hair was silver like moonlight sat in a circle. Their faces were grave, their voices low. "It has been many seasons since we have heard of the dead stirring," one elder said, her voice trembling. Another, with a staff carved in symbols of the ancestors, added, "If the spirits have risen, it is no accident. Such power is not given lightly." The eldest among them, whose eyes were clouded but whose wisdom was clear, raised his hand. We must see for ourselves. If the child is truly guarded by the ancestors, then she carries their will. And we must not defy it. That night, a group of elders walked slowly to the cemetery. The moon was high, casting silver light across the graves. Their footsteps were careful, their hearts heavy with reverence. At the gate they paused. A hush fell over them, for the air itself seemed different within those walls, colder, heavier, yet alive with unseen breath. They pushed the iron open and stepped inside. There, before their eyes, was the girl. She sat quietly beside a tombstone, her hands folded, her face calm. Around her, shadows moved, not wild, not restless, but disciplined like guards on watch. Warriors of long ago stood in silence, their weapons gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Mothers and fathers of forgotten generations lingered close, their eyes steady. The elders trembled, not from fear but awe. One whispered, "She is not abandoned. She is enthroned." The eldest elder stepped forward. His knees shook, but his voice carried strength. "Child," he said softly, "do you know who walks with you?" The girl looked up, her eyes bright with quiet certainty. "They are the ones who were before us. They keep me safe. They teach me." The elders exchanged glances. No further proof was needed. They had seen with their own eyes what the village only whispered. The ancestors had chosen her. The eldest elder lifted his staff and struck it lightly against the earth. "Hear this," he declared, his voice carrying into the night. "This child is not cursed but blessed. She is chosen by the ancestors, and through her they speak. To harm her is to defy them." The spirits stirred as if in agreement, their silent forms standing taller, their presence undeniable. With deep bows the elders stepped back. Their decision was final. By dawn the village would know. The girl once cast aside had become the voice of the ancestors. The revelation of the elders spread through the village like fire carried by the wind. By morning, every household whispered the same truth. The girl was blessed, guarded by the ancestors themselves. And with each telling of the story, the shame of her stepfamily grew heavier. No longer were they seen as cunning or powerful. Now they were spoken of as fools who had tried to cast away a treasure. The downfall began quietly, almost like a slow sickness creeping into their home. Their food stores, once full, began to dwindle. The granary that had never been empty was suddenly overrun with rats. No matter how much grain they tried to save, it spoiled, turning to dust or mold in their hands. The stepmother, who had always strutted proudly through the market, found herself unable to buy enough food, for every trade turned against her. Sellers refused her coins, saying they were cursed, and those who accepted them soon fell sick or suffered loss themselves. The stepsister, who once wore fine clothes and preened in the eyes of others, saw her beauty wither. Her hair, once glossy and full, began to fall in clumps. Her skin, once smooth, grew sallow, her face haunted by nightmares she could not shake. She tried to mask it with laughter, but the villagers only shook their heads, whispering, "The ancestors have taken back what was stolen." Hunger crept into their house like a shadow. Days turned into weeks and the family grew thin. The stepmother's face hollowed, her eyes sunken, while her daughter's voice grew shrill with desperation. They tried to beg from neighbors, but no one would open their doors. "Why should we feed those who threw away their own blood?" the villagers said. "They abandoned an innocent child in the cemetery, yet she has been lifted high while they have fallen low." The cruelty that once gave the stepfamily power now left them empty-handed. People they had mocked or cheated now turned their backs. They were no longer invited to gatherings, no longer offered help in the fields. Children, who once feared the stepmother's tongue, now pointed at her from a distance, calling her the cursed woman. Misfortune followed them wherever they went. When the stepsister tried to fetch water, the pot slipped and shattered on the stones. When the stepmother tried to light a fire, the flames sputtered and died, leaving only smoke. Even the animals avoided them. Goats broke loose rather than be tied near their home, and chickens refused to lay eggs within their yard. The weight of their cruelty pressed down harder each day. The villagers, ashamed that such people had lived among them, distanced themselves further. "The ancestors have judged them," the elders said, "and we must not interfere." Finally, stripped of wealth, shunned by neighbors and consumed by hunger, the stepfamily sat in silence, their once proud heads bowed. They had lost everything: food, beauty, respect, and power. All that remained was the memory of their wickedness and the shadow of what they had done to the girl. It was a punishment worse than death, to live each day reminded that the child they had scorned now walked with the dead as her guardians, while they, living, breathing, and once mighty, were left with nothing but shame.